This morning, as Nigel said, we're actually going to have another history lesson. For those who are here for my message on the American church in the 17 and 1800s, going to be similar to that, but slightly further back in time. But like my last message, there might be a lot of names and dates. Don't get too caught up in that. Big picture, so you're not going to be tested on this at the end. And we're going to start the message with the sad tale of the Druids. I know, early church, why would I start with a pagan religion? Well, very little is actually known about the Druids. Everything that I know came from Asterix comics as a child. Right, but we don't really know what they did, what they thought, how many of them there were, or really much about them. The only thing we really know is that they served as the priests within Celtic society. Now, who were the Celts? Well, they were a people or a culture who actually spread right across Europe, right? They still survive in places like Ireland and Scotland, but actually once upon a time, they spread from Spain through Europe all the way to modern-day Turkey. In fact, the word Galatia, the church in Galatians, that actually is Greek for Gaul, which was France. So Galatia is actually people who settled there from France. Now, for reasons that I'll come to, there are a couple of reasons why we don't know much about the Druids. Firstly, because they actually were a secretive society. But the main reason we don't know much about them is because they happen to fall within the borders of a much larger empire, known as the Roman Empire. And at the start of the first century, again, for reasons I'll come to, just as the church was starting out, Rome issued a series of decrees declaring that the Druids were to be suppressed. Now, what does a Roman mean when they use the word suppressed? Well, it means we're going to round them up and execute all of them and burn their sacred groves. So that by the start of the 2nd century, there were no Druids. They had been erased from history. Now, in reality, Rome was actually usually quite tolerant towards other religions. Whenever they conquered a new territory, they would bring trade, they would bring their administration, they would bring their law and order, but the religion they would simply leave as it was. And if anything, they would actually look to incorporate those religions, those gods, into their own practices. And so they would find, for example, the Greek god Zeus, and they'd say, we like that, we're going to claim him. They'd find the Assyrian gods. They'd find Epona was the Celtic god of ponies. We really like that. We'll add Epona to our pantheon. But when Rome did turn against a religion, the results were devastating and severe. Within 100 years of Rome turning against the Druids, they ceased to exist. And there are other examples of cults or religions where Rome did the same thing and decided to suppress them. The problem is, I can't even name them because the Romans were so good at suppressing them, not even their names have survived to today. But there was one religion that the Romans tried to suppress, which we do, or hopefully should, know a lot about. And that was a small group of believers known as Christians. Now, unlike the Druids, who spread across England, Ireland, and France, Christianity simply started out as a small religion in the far back streets of the Roman Empire, right? 120 people in the upper story in a wee building in Jerusalem is how it started. And it's probably quite hard to see Jerusalem in there, so I'll just enlarge it a wee bit. That yellow dot is where Christianity started. Why is it asking if I want to turn off now? There we go. Turn the page. Okay, so unfortunately, Christianity did come to the attention of the Romans, who didn't like what they saw, and I'll explain that. And so they, again, with Christianity, decided that also needed to be suppressed. And so what happens when this Colossus, this Roman Empire, this destroyer of worlds and nations, turns its strength against the church? Well, the extent of the church in the first century are those red dots there. So what happens to the church after 200 years of the Roman Empire's persecution? Not only did the church spread under Rome's persecution, but Rome became a major hub for Christianity and missionary works. And it is estimated that the church that started as 120 people in Jerusalem reached between 6 and 15 million people by this stage. As the church father Tertullian wrote in 197 AD, "We are but of yesterday, and yet already we fill your cities, islands, camps, your palace, senate, and forum. We have left to you only your temples." In the same way, Pliny the Younger, and yes, there was Pliny the Elder, Pliny the Younger complained to the Roman emperor in 112 AD that pagan temples had been almost deserted and were long neglected, and warned the emperor, "For many persons of every age, every rank, and of both sexes," that's even women, "are and will be endangered by this. For the contagion of this superstition," now mentally note that word superstition, that's an important word, we're coming back to it. "For this superstition has spread not only to the cities, but also to the villages and farms." That was in 112 AD that was the problem. Not only did Christianity thrive, but by the time that Attila the Hun, have you guys heard of Attila the Hun, at least the name? When Attila the Hun invaded Rome in the 5th century, it was the bishop of Rome, not the emperor, who rode out to meet him. Sword by his side, the bishop rides out to negotiate terms on behalf of the Roman Empire. And so all of this begs the question of how. How were the Druids, who spread right across Europe, completely destroyed within 100 years, while the church grew and thrived? Now, obviously, we know the answer. The answer is God. The second the Roman Empire turned itself against the church, it never stood a chance. We know that. And just ask the Soviet Empire how hard it is to destroy the church. And when I say the Soviet Empire, what I should say is ask the 50 million Christians in the former Soviet Empire who wins that fight. But what really happened at ground level? Why did the Romans single out Christianity for persecution? How did the church respond to that? And what can we learn about that today? Those are the things that I want to look at. So question 1, why did Rome single out Christianity? Right, there are lots of religions. Why was it Christianity? Now, to answer this question, we really need to understand Rome's views of religion. Okay, so Rome put religion into 3 categories. The first category was what's called approved religion. Simply, the Latin word is religio. Right, Romans had a god for everything. Not just the 12 gods of Olympus. They had a god for when it rained. They had a god for when it was sunny. They had a god for when it was windy. They had a god for the doorway. They had a god for the fire. They had a god for everything. They even had a god for ponies, I learnt. They had to steal that one from the Celts. Right? Not only gods, they also believed in spirits. Now, they use the word genius. That's a spirit. The plural is genii, and I have to explain that because it will come up. Right? And a genius was kind of like a guardian spirit. Right? A waterfall might have a guardian spirit or a genius. An oak tree, or the city of Rome. And that might be a bit hard to process, but when you look at the Statue of Liberty, Lady Liberty embodying that value, that's kind of what they saw. this version of liberty, there was a god that represented it. And so the Statue of Liberty would be an example of that. England had Britannia. Have anyone seen like statues in England have this woman with a trident and a shield, Britannia embodying the values of the British Empire? Well, Rome had all of that for all of these things. Those are what were known as geniuses or genii. But for the Romans, worship wasn't personal. It was about what they called pietas. Now, you probably immediately think, piety. But it had very little to do with devotion or your relationship with God, or even whether you're a good person. For Romans, pietas was closer to what you'd describe as duty, your duty. Yes, your duty to the gods, but mainly your duty to society and to your ancestors. Because you see, for them, worship of the gods was kind of like a contract that they had with the gods. We will worship you, and you will bless us. If we stop worshipping you, you'll send a plague, or an army, or a famine, or something to destroy us. And just think about that for a moment. To live in a society where there are hundreds of gods that you have to keep happy, or they will destroy your city. Right? And so it does become a duty of every citizen to make sure you're keeping those gods happy. Are you doing your bit? Are you doing your bit? Is everyone doing their bit to keep our city safe from the gods? Now, if nothing else, that also might explain why the gospel really was the gospel. You mean God graciously extends his mercy to us free? He does it all? His good grace, won by Jesus? And I don't have to do all of this hard work? That sounds like good news. Back to the Romans, though. Pietas was seen as the duty of every Roman citizen, right? And it was the highest virtue in Roman society. Right? Romans didn't value honor, they didn't value honesty or kindness or even love above this virtue of pietas. It was the highest. And it wasn't just a religious duty, it was a civic duty. Because you couldn't be an effective senator or a general of an army if the gods were against you. So your duty as a senator was to appease the gods. Your duty as the general was to appease the gods. It was a civic duty that you had. And in fact, the highest person in the Roman Emperor, the empire, was also the Pontifex Maximus. He was the highest priest. On behalf of the whole nation, his job was to keep all of these gods happy. So right, that's the first point, pietas. For Romans, the worship of God, it was a duty rather than personal and based on morality. Now we're going to move to the second point that we need to cover, ancient beliefs. See, Romans knew that their empire was built on the blood and the death of their ancestors. And so they felt obliged as custodians for what their ancestors had given them. I'm really wealthy because they did all that for me. I owe them a debt. But Rome didn't just see themselves as custodians for their own ancestors. They saw themselves as custodian for everyone's ancestors. Anyone who had these ancient traditions that they had, Rome thought it's our obligation for their ancestors to preserve that. And one such group of people were the Jews. Because as you read the Gospels, you really do get a sense that the Jews were an absolute thorn in the side of the Roman Empire. They were just so annoying, and they had this single invisible God, and they refused to do anything related to the Roman gods. They were so stubborn. And yet, Rome respected them because they had an ancient religion. And just to give you an idea of timelines, about the time that Israel was sent off to exile in Babylon, so that's towards the end of the Old Testament, that was about the time that Rome was first settled. Right, so most of the Bible predates Rome itself. Now they thought, wow, this is an ancient religion. There's a lot about the Jews we don't respect, but they are strictly adhering to their ancestors' traditions and values, and we as Romans have an obligation to protect that. And in fact, Rome often released the Jews from obligations that bound the whole empire. Rome would say, this is a rule that everyone must follow, but we're going to release the Jews because they are sticking to their ancestors' ways. And the last one is superstition. Did anyone lock that word up? Right? For Romans, superstition was basically the absolute opposite of pietas. If pietas focused on the worship of gods as part of your social duty, pietas was a religion that debased humanity, that destroyed society and angered the gods. Right? These people didn't just put themselves at risk, they put all of society at risk. And so they needed to be suppressed for the good of society. Now, in the first century, word reached Rome that the Druids practiced human sacrifice to the gods. And to the Romans, that was just a bridge too far. That was debasing of humanity. To appease the gods, we must stop this religion. And so the Druids were labelled a superstition. Now, what about the church? Well, for most of the first century, so when the Gospels were written, Rome considered Christianity to be a part of Judaism. And as such, it fell under that same protection that they afforded to the Jews. Because remember, the apostles themselves were Jews, and they argued for the divinity of Jesus Christ based on the Old Testament scriptures. So to the Romans, they're like, well, this is just a different sect of Judaism. But following a massive fire that destroyed 2/3 of Rome, Emperor Nero needed a scapegoat. The rumours were that he started it because A, he was insane, and B, he actually wanted to redesign Rome. He had long planned to redevelop it. The problem was there was a city in the way. Thankfully, 10 out of its 14 districts mysteriously burnt down, and then people started to wonder, well, how did that happen? Well, thankfully for Nero, he found a secretive group who worshipped a criminal and said the world would end by fire. Seems to be obvious that it was the Christians. And so that brought about the first official wave of persecution under Rome. Numerous Christians were killed, and it probably extended to Paul and Peter during that time. That was the first official persecution, but as I say, it was really only limited to Rome. And at that time, they thought Christians were just part of Judaism. And just to be clear, when I speak, I'm only going to talk about Rome's official policies on the church. And I say that because as you read the book of Acts, angry mobs definitely formed their own view. Right? Whatever Rome thought, the angry mob always had the last say. I'm only going to talk about Rome's official policies. Read the book of Acts and you'll see that that's quite different. But things changed with Rome towards the end of the first century. Because at some point they realized this wasn't a part of Judaism. This was a separate religion. Not ancient, deserving of protection. It was separate. And not only separate, but it was new. And it was spreading. And as Christianity spread, more and more people came to oppose it. Not only the Jews, but also the pagan priests, the blacksmiths, the tailors, anyone who was financially impacted by the spread of Christianity. I read one account of the first church that was built in Rome was opposed by none other than the local bars. Right? They didn't want Christians around because that was bad for business. But those opponents of Christianity were very quick to emphasize aspects of Christianity that to Roman sensibilities might seem offensive. Because I don't know if you know this, but you follow someone who claimed to be king, promised he would bring a new kingdom, was executed as a criminal by the Roman authorities who didn't want a king creating a new kingdom, told his followers to eat his flesh and drink his blood, allowed the marriage of believers who called each other brother and sister, and said the world was going to end in fire. And that wasn't even the worst bit for the Romans. The worst bit was that Christianity was popular with slaves. Now Spartacus, have you heard of Spartacus? He led a slave revolt with 50,000 slaves, and it took 2 years to quell that. The Roman Empire had 5 million slaves. The last thing you want is slaves talking about things like freedom and dignity and rights. That is dangerous. So Christianity seemed like it was dangerous for society. And rumours of incest and things like that, it was dehumanizing. And the Christians, they didn't help themselves. They worshipped in private, often at night time. And as we know, nothing good happens at night. The reality was they did that because most of them were working class and during the day they had to work. But they had no temple, no idols, and they practiced no sacrifices. And they refused to worship the pagan gods, as was their duty. If you want to worship Jesus in your private time, that's absolutely fine by me, but you have a duty to society to worship the pagan gods. Well, the Christians refused. In fact, one of the most common charges against Christians was that they were atheists. And just incidentally, if you think that the modern church gets a bad reputation in the media, just remember that the early Christians were labelled as incestuous, cannibalistic atheists who worshipped a criminal and sought to destroy the world by fire. We don't have it that bad. But in terms of the actual persecution, even though Christianity was technically a superstition, it was technically illegal, it tended to come in waves, and often it was regional. Many of the first emperors didn't really seem to care about Christianity, mainly because they seemed to be good citizens. They weren't actually creating much of an issue. So it wasn't really driven by the state, at least at the start. But decades could pass without incident. But then a new governor might turn up, or a priest, or simply someone who's rich and gets offended, and they'd kick up a fuss and a wave of persecution would flow through the city. Or maybe they just needed to fill the Colosseum, right? Or maybe the rabble just got a bit too drunk at one of their festivals and decided, let's just round up the Christians. But a good indication of the views or the attitudes around the persecution comes from a letter that I quoted earlier from Pliny the Younger about this superstition. Now, I'll put the letter up, but I'll just summarise the key parts. And you can find this online if you want. Just look up Pliny the Younger letter and you'll find it. So he was a governor in an area called Bithynia, which is in modern-day Turkey. And see, he had some people who were arrested and charged with being Christian. And they were given 3 opportunities to recant. And some people did, and they swore by various idols to show that they weren't Christians. But others, even after torture, refused to recant, and so they were executed. Now, to Pliny, this refusal to accept his mercy 3 times over simply went on to show these people were guilty. The problem was, he didn't know of what. And so he actually had to write to the emperor. Well, look, am I arresting these people? Is being Christian itself enough? Or am I looking for some crime that these guys are supposed to be committing? Is it just being Christian, or is it more? And he even tortured a couple of deaconesses. And he learned from them that, well, they meet at dawn, they sing a hymn, they bind themselves to avoid any sorts of sin, and then they meet later on for a meal, which he described as harmless. And he concluded that their only offence was a debased superstition carried out to great lengths. That was the only charge you could have against them. These guys are just way too into it. But the emperor's response was basically that he'd done the right thing, that he shouldn't seek out Christians, but if they are brought to him, they need to either be punished or executed if they don't recant. It was that simple. And actually, I did look at some trials, and they are pretty swift, some of them. I saw one where the judge said, "Are you a Christian?" And he said, yes. Verdict given, guilty, executed. Someone in the crowd stood up and objected to that process. Sounds like you're a Christian. I am. 2 execution orders. A third person said, you can't do that. 1 trial, 3 executions. All right, very swift. But as I say, it was often regional. Now, I did actually note Tertullian, who's one of the authors, just as an example, he said that actually in Africa, the governors were actually pretty lenient, and often they actually sought an acquittal. That isn't to say Africa was a safe place, because there were still the mobs, but that explains actually the early church was incredibly strong in Africa. Most of the writings that we have from the early church, and even the translations, most of the stuff is actually written out of Africa. Right? The Vulgate, the Latin translation, came out of Africa. It's Carthage. But over time, Rome's official policy did start to tighten, and it got more organised, and this coincided with emperor worship. You see, with all the peoples and all the languages and all the cultures that the Roman Empire covered, what is it that these people even have in common? What does someone in the very northern tips of Britannia have in common with someone in Egypt? Turns out the only thing they had in common was the emperor. And so how is it that you can come up with a policy empire-wide to test someone's loyalty to the empire? And the answer is emperor worship. Simply have them swear before the emperor's genius, his spirit, to their loyalty. And so there's the spirit, for example, of Augustus, or his genius. It was a little idol or a statue that simply looked like him and embodied the emperor. And all you had to do was light some incense before that and swear your loyalty and pray to it. Now, emperor worship had been around for a long time, but it eventually became mandatory for every citizen to swear their loyalty. And the problem is the Christians simply couldn't swear before another god. And that really put them at odds with the Roman Empire. And I tried to find the numbers, but it's pretty hard to gauge. Some people put it between 1 and 3 million Christians were martyred during this period. And that sounds like a lot, but when there were 6 million Christians, if just 2% of them were martyred every year, that's 120,000 Christians a year being killed. So how did the church respond to this persecution? That's the real question. Well, the answer is they didn't rail against the pagan culture around them. 1 Peter 2 verse 12, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of his visiting us. See, Christians, they didn't rail against the gladiatorial games or drunkenness or the sex and nudity at the theatre. They just didn't attend and sought to avoid those sorts of things in their own lives. They didn't condemn parents who abandoned their babies to die of exposure, but they quietly went and rescued those children and raised them as their own. They didn't condemn the rich, but they simply gave to the poor. And I saw one bishop who was accused of not giving to the temple of Juno, and he simply said, if the God wants it, the God can come down and take the money. Until then, I'm going to give it to the poor. And if you're talking COVID, during the Antonine Plague that killed 1/4 of the Roman Empire, 25% of the Roman Empire, anyone who was able to fled the cities, except the Christians, who stayed to tend to the sick and the poor and the needy. They remained behind to care for the people. Now, they didn't have protective equipment. They didn't have gloves or masks. They didn't have antiseptic wipes. Right? They simply cared for the sick and themselves got sick and died in huge numbers. Well, that was the price that I have to pay if there's the chance that my patient might survive. And often that would be the case. The patient lives, the Christian who's caring for them dies. During the plague of Cyprian, which is actually named after the Bishop of Carthage. It's called that because he responded to the plague by asking for money from the rich, service for the poor, and preaching to his congregation not to worry about the dead who are in heaven, but to redouble their efforts for the living, whether Christian or pagan. And it's been estimated that during those plagues, where there are cities with established Christian numbers, the death rate in those cities was half that of other cities. And despite all of their hatred towards the Christians, the pagans saw values in Christianity that they wanted. At the end of the day, Rome wanted to be virtuous. They wanted to live good lives. They talked about it, they wrote about it, they searched for it. But they saw it in Christianity. Right? Great orators such as Cicero or Horace spoke about the bravery required of their soldiers. The Roman virtue, it is good and fitting to die for your nation. But that bravery that they spoke of, they would see it on the face of a 12-year-old girl marching into the arena with dignity on her face to die. Now, she hadn't read Cicero. She's never heard of Horace or any of the great philosophers who write about bravery, and yet here she is demonstrating it. I don't know what the great orators say, but we want that on that 12-year-old girl's face. Why doesn't our army have that? And it was the same with kindness and generosity and love and marriage. In Rome, marriage was a huge issue because you married for wealth and station and you had your mistress for love. That was a huge issue that they tried to reform. And yet here these Christians were in loving marriages, two people, monogamous and thriving. And the Romans looked at that and felt envy. Now, to quote Taylor Swift, haters gonna hate. And it's fair to say that the judges and governors, they weren't necessarily impressed by the stubbornness and bravery shown by the Christians. It annoyed them because they wanted them to recant and to walk away. And this bravery just frustrated them. But the crowds, many of them, they were impressed. So the church won many people over, not with words, but with their actions. What else did the church do? Well, they actually submitted to the emperor. Funnily enough, that's biblical. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority. Surely it means just the good ones, right? To every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to the governors. Unfortunately, the Bible's really clear about that. And so, yes, they wrote to the governors and they asked for toleration. And we still have those letters today, and I'll be quoting from Tertullian in quite a bit. But they argued for toleration based on Roman law, philosophy, classical literature, reason, history, natural justice, and the scriptures. But they did that in deference to the emperor. And they prayed for the emperor. And again, the Bible says, I urge you then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercessions, thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. Now remember, Christians were primarily accused of being disloyal because they wouldn't pray to the emperor's genius or his spirit. That was why they were said to be disloyal. And I love Tertullian's response for this. He simply says, well, we're used to exercising them, not swearing by them. You say the emperor has a spirit, bring him over, we'll deal with it. All right? But he went on to say that Christians were the emperor's most loyal subjects because they prayed for him not just once a year on command to a lifeless statue. They prayed, as he says, we pray always for all emperors, for their long life, untroubled reign, safe house, strong armies, faithful senate, loyal people, quiet world, and whatever he wishes would be, both as man and Caesar. These things I can ask from no other than him whom I know that I shall obtain them. He wasn't going to ask some lump of lead for the emperor's safety. What can a lump of lead do? He was going to go to the Most High King who had the power to do that. And they didn't pray, God, give us a new emperor. Give us a better one. They had an emperor. He may have been good. He may have been cruel. It didn't matter. That was who they had. And so that is who they prayed for. In fact, the church saw themselves as the only ones who could protect the emperor. Because sure, the emperor had his legions, but who was protecting him in the spiritual realm? Who was protecting him from spiritual attack? Who, if not the church, could possibly intercede for the emperor? And so the church were absolutely committed to praying for the emperor, even as they were being condemned and executed for their disloyalty to him. So then, Tertullian says, as we are stretching forth our hands to God, let your claws dig into us, your crosses suspend us, your fires burn us, your swords decapitate us, your wild beasts spring upon us. Pursue your course, excellent governors, and crush out the soul, praying to God on the emperor's behalf. You can execute us, we're going to be praying for that emperor. And they didn't retaliate. Christ suffered for you, leaving an example that you should follow in his steps. When they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. And it would have been so easy for the church to take their revenge. Even one night with a few torches might amply work our revenge, was Tertullian's point. If we wanted to attack you guys, we could have done it. Or they could have sided with one of Rome's enemies, either internally or sided with them, overthrow the government. In fact, the church could have absolutely crippled the Roman Empire simply by walking away. Right? All they had to say is, no, you know what, we've had enough. It's too much, we're leaving. And overnight, Rome loses 6 million of its workforce. Absolutely cripples the nation. So what changed? Well, by 250 BC, Christians comprised a huge percentage of the Roman Empire. Some cities, such as Antioch, where the church was very dominant then, at least half the population were now Christian. And people found the Christian arguments persuasive. It was commonly accepted that the pagan philosophers simply had no response to these Christian arguments. And as for the policy of persecution, the fact is it didn't work. Firstly, it didn't actually stop Christians. In fact, one bishop in Africa had to warn his church, stop trying to get martyred. Can you imagine Nigel giving the notices? We've got tithes, offerings, and people. Look, if you get arrested, that's one thing. Don't walk up to the soldiers and declare that you're a Christian, okay? Stop doing that. They might arrest you. Let it happen naturally. Stop trying to get killed, people. But by now, it wasn't just some random member of a weird cult being executed. It was your neighbour. It was your teacher. It was a sibling. Someone that, well, you know they're a good person. And you know that they're not a criminal. And the more gross and grievous the execution, the more it highlighted, these people haven't done anything wrong. And as Tertullian put it, no cruelty of yours, though each were to exceed the last in its exquisite refinement, profits you in the least, but forms rather an attraction to our sect. We spring up in greater numbers as often as we are mown down by you. The blood of Christians is the seed of new life. For who is not aroused by the sight of it? Right? When you see someone going to execution, to going to these savage animals or whatever torture they're unleashing, and all they have to do is recant and swear in front of an idol. And they don't. Why? Why on earth don't they just do this? What is it that's causing thousands upon thousands of these Christians to do that. So rather, there's an attraction to our and then he goes on to say, and who then, when he is inquired, does not adopt it? Right? Makes you wonder. You start asking those questions. The book of Peter says, be prepared to give an explanation for the hope that you have. Read that chapter and see how many times he uses the word suffering before and after. The context isn't, Stephen, you've got a stable job and a happy wife and, life's going great. How do you manage it? No, it's in the context of suffering. How do you have that hope? And then who, when they have adopted it, does not choose to suffer in order that he may acquire the whole grace of God? Hence it is, at the moment of your sentencing us, we give thanks. Now, they didn't have microphones back there, but that was Tertullian's drop the quill moment, right? Turn and walk away after that. Now, the last persecutor of the church was Diocletian, but many in his own house were Christian. In fact, it was rumoured that even that extended to his wife and daughter. Now, in his time, Rome was split into two empires. His successor was Galerius, who acknowledged on his deathbed that persecution had failed, and so he passed an edict of toleration in 311 AD, granting the church clemency on the basis that they would pray for the empire. In the West, Constantius simply refused to enforce the rules against the church. His son was a man by the name of Constantine, who converted to Christianity on the eve of a battle for his right to rule. Now, that's a story of its own, but one of the first things that he did was pass the Edict of Milan, which recognised Christianity as a religio, as a religion. And that officially brought the persecution to an end in Rome. And so just to conclude, what can we learn from that? And you can form your own views, but here's a couple of things I concluded. Firstly, is that we are to be the light. See, that the world is covered in darkness. How do we fix that? Do we criticise the darkness for being dark? Do we ask the darkness to fix itself? Do we wade into the darkness with our sleeves rolled up and try and fix it ourselves? And the answer is no. Your job is to be the light. That's your focus. It's so tempting, though, to focus on the dark, to want to fix it, to wish it would fix itself. Why can't the government pass better laws? Can't we get someone better in there? If only I were in charge. The early church was surrounded by slavery, executions, gladiatorial games, drunkenness, debauchery, and pagan temples. So much they could have tried to fix. And instead, they met every morning and vowed to fix themselves, to focus on making themselves better. They didn't focus on the darkness, they focused on the light, on becoming the light. Because where the light shines, darkness simply disappears. Constantine, when he converted to Christianity, he didn't just pass the Edict of Milan, he also banned crucifixions, banned the use of criminals in the Colosseum, and ran a raft of social reforms. Because when light comes, darkness lifts. And as a reminder, the American revival, right? Police officers volunteering in the choir because there was no crime. Businesses shutting down at lunchtime to allow prayer meetings. So if you want the world to be fixed, the answer is simple. Read your Bible. Spend time in prayer. Focus on the light. And then become the light. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying the church should be passive. Jesus fed the hungry and healed the sick. But the answer isn't to say, great, Jesus fed the hungry, let's feed the hungry everywhere. The answer is, no, let's bring Jesus everywhere. Because where he is, everything else gets sorted. Right? And there are plenty of organisations who fight darkness. I like to support organisations who meet needs but also bring the light. Now, the next one is humility. Now, Elijah spoke last week about the blessing of Joseph. Joseph, given a great vision of the church, a vision of his destiny, and instead sold into slavery, cast into jail, and spent years there. But later on, through humble service, he ends up ruling the Egyptian empire, subject only to Pharaoh himself, with the fate of the entire empire in his hands. And you might think, well, that's the Bible, but it's just different for some reason with us, right? Look at the church, promised to be the radiant bride of Christ, God's people, chosen to bring the gospel to the ends of the earth, right? Entering into the courts of the kings themselves. All things happening for good. Great promises. Immediately cast out of Jerusalem, then cast out of Rome, labelled criminals, persecuted for 300 years. And then, in 552 AD, when Attila the Hun marches on Rome, it is Bishop Leo, the Bishop of Rome, who rides out to meet him. Not as an outcast of Rome, not as a criminal, but with a banner held high, with the full authority of the Roman emperor to speak on his behalf. And then, through negotiations, Attila simply withdraws, and Leo rides back as the saviour of Rome. Now, does that sound like Joseph's blessing? But what did it cost to get there? And the answer is thousands, maybe even millions of Christians laying down their lives. And not just through persecution, through service. Through doing service, laying down their lives and asking for nothing in return. That is what purchased it, so that hundreds of years later, the Roman emperor would come to Bishop Leo and say, "You have served us faithfully for so long, I need you to serve us once more." Tertullian could have flexed his muscle. The church could have mobilized. Instead, they faithfully served. And the last thing is prayer. And I cannot emphasize enough how important that was to the church. They prayed constantly. And the whole time I've spoken, I've only given you half the story. I've spoken about what happened on earth. Every victory they had on earth was won in heaven first. Right? And as it says, we win on earth when we win in heaven. But we win in heaven when we pray on earth. Every advance of the church was first won in heaven. And so how was it that 120 people somehow would take over the Roman Empire? Well, the answer is not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord Almighty. So that's all I had to say. So I'll just quickly pass it on to Nigel. I'm aware time has run, so pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, Steve. Well done. That was fantastic. That was so helpful, wasn't it? I'm not too good on the history thing because I haven't read enough, so I know that Steve has to do a lot of work to get that information, which I absolutely appreciate, because it just, man, that brings so many things to light from the scriptures that you read. Have a context, don't they? There's a story behind it. And when we read so many of these things in these New Testament writers are telling us and encouraging us and warning us and reminding us about, there's a context. And the context was typically suffering and persecution, and from a pagan environment. And remember, Steve mentioned about, a few things also from the Old Testament, but that same condition set for the people of God in Egypt for hundreds of years as slaves, and what they were taught to do. And then later on, when the people of God were exiled into Babylon for 70 years, when you read the book of Daniel, when you read the book of Jeremiah, and all these things, pray for the peace and prosperity of the city that you've been exiled to. It wasn't their city, they were pagan people. And yet what they did, same with Joseph. And then in the New Testament, it's the same thing. So whatever you feel about the situations and the circumstances that face us today, can I encourage you to take to heart what Steve has shared and the importance of knowing who we are, why we're here, and what we're supposed to be doing. Because there's a lot of things that can get us distracted. There's a lot of things that can get us divided. There's a lot of things that we can pour our attention into. But the church is the only one that has the gospel of the kingdom. The church is the only one that has an eternal hope. The church is the only one that's got that message. So if we're not preaching that message, no one's hearing it. And the world needs the hope that you have in Jesus Christ. True? So stay busy being light. Check what your current conversation is. Check what your current messages are. Check what your current service activity is. What is it that you're busy with? Let's be busy bringing light, and let's learn from those ancient Christians of all that they faced and were subjected to, and yet the blessing they brought. That's our job here. Cool? I trust you're on board with that. Thanks again, Steve. That was brilliant. That's been helpful for me, just getting a better perspective of some of the scriptures we read in the New Testament. So helpful.